Conti, everybody. I hope it's everybody can see and hear everything very well. My name is Amanda Fant, and I am a Cree Soto Métis artist and researcher based in Trondheim, Norway. I'd like to welcome everyone to Resource Extraction, Relationality and Resurgence Towards a Bodyland Pedagogy, a webinar keynote lecture by Professor Isabel Altamirano Jimenez. I am very honored to open our conference by introducing the first keynote for our online conference series, The Poetics and Ethics of Learning with Indigenous, Canadian, and Québécois Feminist Productions Today. I'd like to first acknowledge the place, Tronte, the land, Sapmi, and the Sami peoples who continue to fight for protection for their lands. In addition, I would like to acknowledge my homeland of Treaty 4 in Canada and the matriarchs who continue to lead our communities with strength.
Hello. Good morning, Edmonton. Good evening, Trondheim. And hello to the 84 participants who are joining us today from every corner in the world. My name is Libe García-Tarrant, and I'm an associate professor in literature and English in the Department of Teacher Education at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. So I want to welcome everyone to the opening lecture of this international conference, which marks yet another exciting collaboration between the English section in the Department of Teacher Education at NTNU and the Canadian Literature Center at the University of Alberta in Canada. So I just want to say that I'm originally from Spain, but I moved here to the city of Trondheim 3 years ago, and I'm lucky to be a guest here. So I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous communities in Sapmi. And I also want to add that Alberta holds a very special place in my heart, as I learned and unlearned so much in there. So with respect, I also want to acknowledge the place, Edmonton, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, the land of many Indigenous peoples, including the Papasache and the Métis.
Thanks, Liba. I'd like to welcome our two other co-organizers, Dominique Ketu, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Classical and Modern Languages at Brandon University, and Marie Cariad, former Director of the Canadian Literature Center at the University of Alberta, and currently Associate Dean, Research Faculty of Arts, U of A, where she's also Professor in the Department of English and Film Studies. So I'm going to give you an overview of today's event. This session will consist of the keynote lecture of around 25 minutes, and then a Q&A of 20 minutes. So we'd really like to ask everyone to post your questions or comments right away as soon as we start the talk in the question and answer box. We'll collect them and hold the question after the lecture. Question and answer after the lecture. We'd also like to give participants the opportunity to ask their questions themselves if you feel comfortable with that.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So I think maybe before we start, and for those participants who are not part of the conference, let me just say that this is the second part of a conference series that started in October 2018. So what we did is over 30 speakers gathered in Banff in Alberta at a time when this was still possible to discuss the trope of living with, as illustrated in contemporary Indigenous, Canadian, and Québécois feminist productions. So now we're in this second iteration, which we're kicking off today, and we seek to continue thinking together about these topics, while maybe placing an emphasis on the notion of learning with, which we envision, and you may be able to see this in the call for papers, which we envision as a methodological, pedagogical, as well as an aesthetic position with transformative ethical consequences. So in order to make this possible, we would like to say a few thanks before we start, because there's many individuals, institutions, and communities who have supported us in this journey. So maybe I can start by thanking folks at this side of things. So First of all, I would like to thank Amanda Fayant, our wonderful co-organizer. I would also like to thank the head of research in the Department of Teacher Education at NTNU for his incredible support, Jesper Agar Peterson. Also, the strategic funds we received through the project Translate. I would also like to thank Gender Hub at NTNU, in particular Jennifer Branlat, and the Literature for Inclusion program led by Gulabuddin Sukanwar. And I think they're both watching, so hello from here. And across the ocean, I would also like to thank our co-organizers, Marie Carrière and Dominique Etu, for their wonderful support and help. Also, Matt and the rest of the team at the CLC in Alberta. I guess we also want to thank, of course, like the University of Alberta in general, but in particular the Office of the Vice President for Research and Innovation, and also a Faculty of Arts and the Department of English and Film Studies.
Okay, so I'm gonna just give a little bit of an overview first about what's coming up in our conference event, so that's exciting. I'd like to mention that in 2021, we're excited to announce that writer Alicia Elliott will present in January. From February, our exciting program will continue with writer-poet Lucas Crawford, scholar-artist Dr. Sherry Farrell-Rosette, and artist Cecil M. Berg. We'll also have a series of workshops featuring individual papers and panels. So now on to our keynote speaker. We're very honored to have Isabel Altamirano Jimenez. She is Bineza from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, Mexico. She did help me with that before. She is a professor of political science and Canadian Research Chair in Comparative Indigenous Feminist Studies at the University of Alberta. Her project, as part of her Canadian Research Chair, examines the connections among body, land, dispossession, and Indigenous refusal in Western Canada and Southern Mexico. Her research SSHRC project, Body, Land, and Consent, has been funded by Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This project documents how Indigenous women experience the impacts of resource extraction and explores what happens to the land intersects with what happens with their bodies. She teaches Indigenous political thought and decolonization, Indigenous politics in Canada, and Indigenous feminisms. Not only are these essential topics for my own work as a researcher and artist, these are also vital subjects to teach in classrooms here in Norway and in Canada, especially in this time of increased political and social participation by diverse communities. Among her books are Living on the Land, Indigenous Women Understandings of Place, co-edited with Natalie Kermol, The Neoliberal State, Recognition and Indigenous Rights, New Paternalisms to New Beginnings, co-edited with Deirdre Howard Wagner and Maria Barg, and Indigenous Encounters with Neoliberalism, Place, Women, and the Environment in Canada and Mexico. Drawing from different methodologies, these books investigate the relationships among body, land, resource, extraction, and Indigenous refusal in Western Canada and Southern Mexico. For those in Trondheim, all of Isabel's books are available at NTNU. The title of Isabel's keynote lecture today is Resource Extraction, Relationality, and Resurgent Towards a Body-Land Pedagogy. Miigwech, and welcome, Isabel.
Badjuji, everyone, thank you for having me. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Treaty 6 territory, specifically from Amiskwasiwaskahikant, also known as Edmonton, a gathering territory of the Cree, Nakurasu, Métis, Papas Chase, and other Indigenous nations whose histories and present forces us to think of the ongoing colonial reality in Canada. I also want to thank the organizing committee, especially Marie Carrière, for inviting me to deliver this digital keynote. This conference is concerned with critical and pedagogical practices that propose sustainable ethics and responsible pedagogies. In this presentation, I want to explore the nexus resource extraction, Indigenous embodied experiences, and resurgence. Focusing on the anti-mining struggle of the Zapotec community of Calpulalpan in Oaxaca, Mexico, I look at how indigenous peoples co-think and co-feel with the non-human world, and how indigenous women reimagine relationality in transformational ways. This talk is part of a bigger project of a book that I'm currently writing and tentatively titled Body, Land, and Consent. I will begin by mapping a body-land framework that on the one hand, historicizes the ways in which relationships have been disjointed, and on the other, centers place-specific embodied practices. I focus on the notion of relationality to explore how communalism prefigures the grounded practices that remembers body, community, and territory. Then I examine how Calpulalpan place-based resurgence practices have been shaped by indigenous women. And finally, I will outline a land-based pedagogy for learning and researching with indigenous women. Resource extraction has been long a site of contestation over place, identity, feelings, and experiences. It operates through material and immaterial processes in which experiential meanings and life forms are transformed into commodities. However, the term resource conceals the fact that natural resources are constituted in place. Indigenous stories of how people relate to place and the non-human world encourage us to envision alternative ways of being in the world. As an analytical tool, Bodyland is useful to explore the mutually constitutive relationships between indigenous felt experiences and place. This unified concept not only centers the ontological relationships between different bodies, but also the conscious actions that uphold and maintain relationships. Relationality exists at an epistemological level and in the everyday practices through which people do and act. Relationality is not metaphorical. It doesn't exist just because we claim it's there, but rather because we practice it in active and engaged ways. Reciprocal relationships come into existence through doing. It is a verb. It is a way of organizing indigenous polities, learning and producing knowledge. For example, indigenous peasants' experiences of climate change don't necessarily correspond with scientific studies, but rather with the changes they observe in the process of co-feeling and co-producing ecosystems with other non-human beings. In the book of Mayan laws, the Popol Vuh, human beings are not above nature. Rather, they are part of a community made of human bodies, spirits, non-human beings, and supernatural forces. For my people, the Biniza, territories cannot be divided into surface and subsurface resources. Water and forest are considered sacred forms of life on the land. The subsoil, on the other hand, represents the roots, the seeds that make possible the existence of mountains, water, plants, and so on. Thus, the surface and subsurface are part of the spiritual, symbolic, and material life of indigenous communities. These stories reveal the corporeal knowledge that indigenous peoples have and have developed through our interactions with territory. Relationships among human beings, spirits, animals, land, water, evoke a multiplicity of actions and inactions that shape how we organize and manage ourselves. Territory is not only the geographic space in which bodies are located, but also the web of social relationships that people develop among themselves and with place. While relationality connects the multiple strands of materiality, corporeality, kinship, affect, and land and body, I propose the concept of body land as a way to center how these relationships play out in distinctive yet interconnected processes. Because relationality is an action-oriented way of being in the world, it is important to see how it is enacted by specific bodies and in a specific context. Relationships are not fixed. They change and have changed over time, but they can also be reclaimed in ways that are transformational. Like colonialism, capitalism creates social separation among different forms of life. It relies on the fragmentation of relationships and the hierarchical organization of life, non-life, and gender relations. These economic political formations have produced dynamics that erode the multiple relationships that constitutes indigenous communal life. Against the anti-relationality impulses of colonialism and capitalism, indigenous communities in Oaxaca have persisted on making community. Communal ways of doing and living, or communality, the term used in Oaxaca in southern Mexico, has been key to indigenous survivance, to use Wisniew's words. Commitment to live in community is what makes us members of our nations. It is not our language, history, or other attributes alone, but the responsibility to be in good relationships with one another. Relationships constitute both a responsibility and a possibility. As responsibility, they glue our collective life together. As a possibility, relationships have the potential to create a better future. Although this concept is crucial to understanding indigenous struggles to defend territory in Oaxaca, indigenous women have problematized essentialized notions of community. Colonial and state policies and legislations have produced gender and racialized categories of belonging and exclusion, which have been naturalized in our communities. Communality emphasizes symmetry and complementary relationships. However, Aymara feminist and activist Julieta Paredes remind us of such emphasis can conceal the unequal division of work, in which one part of the complement ends up performing work that is perceived to be of less value within the community. By challenging essentialized notions of community, indigenous women have questioned the division between what happens on the landscape of their bodies and the historical processes that have affected their communal territory. Thus, while supporting their communities' laws, indigenous women and gender diverse individuals not only challenge patriarchal practices within their communities, but also how relationality as a way of being in community is embodied and enacted in everyday life. Oaxaca, specifically the Northern Highlands, has a common history of indigenous land defense that evolved into resurgence politics since the 1970s. Capulalpan de Mendez is a Zapotec town governed by its traditional laws, and like other communities in the region, it is characterized by the strength of its communal governance practices. The region is covered with pine and pine oak forests, which are communally owned and sustainably managed as a result of these communal struggles to regain their control in the 1980s. This town is emblematic among indigenous communities that successfully manage their communal forest. However, Capulalpan is no stranger to the extraction of natural resources, which started with mining in the 1870s with the discovery of gold and silver. Mining was then presented as the economic activity that was supposedly to finally bring progress to Oaxaca, especially the highlands. By the early 1900s, the Natividad mine had become the richest operation in Oaxaca, employing Zapotecs and other indigenous people from different communities. Despite Capulalpan's communal land title, in 1954, the community learned that the federal government had granted a timber concession to a paper mill company without its consent. Over 2 decades, through intensive and devastating practices, the paper mill exploited both the forest and indigenous labor. Capulalpan resentment with the government reverberated throughout the region. The community joined other 12 Zapotec and Chinantec communities to create the Organization for the Defense of Natural Resource in the Juarez Highlands in the early 1980s. The purpose was to reclaim control over the communal forests and revitalize the governance systems and forms of solidarity within and among indigenous communities. Against colonial and capitalist imperatives that separate land and body, life, non-life, and human, non-human, indigenous communal practices center relationships and coming together. In 1982, when the timber concession was about to expire, a woman from the community learned that the government was planning to renew and extend the permit. She quickly mobilized other women, and together they decided to act on the responsibility to protect their community's resources. Although women's participation in the traditional governance systems and the communal assembly is limited, they felt the responsibility to defend their territory. They literally use their bodies to prevent trucks from getting in and out of the community. A Calpulalpan resident noted, women's response was practically stronger than men. It was women who decided to block the roads. It was women who used their bodies to stop the trucks. As part of the strategies, Calpulalpan residents collectively refused to work at the paper mill. The movement of women's bodies coming together, the quietness of their bodies blocking the road, or what Foster calls steel activism, were crucial to stop the circulation of timber extracted from their territory. Calpulalpan was successful in preventing the expansion of the concession. It initiated a long process to create a communal forestry that emphasized local use value over profit and the close connection between community and forest. In doing so, community members transformed social control and domination into a force for social change. Women not only participated in the movement for the defense of forests, but they were also instrumental in building the communal project. They challenged male authorities' sense of responsibility and insisted on revitalizing the communal ethos. Through their participation, Indigenous women created new practices for communities to act upon their authority. However, women's activism remained invisible. Calpulalpan became eventually a model of sustainable community-driven forestry, recognized national and international for the strength and vitality of its communal governance institutions. While celebrated for it, in 2000, this community learned that the Mexican Ministry of Economics had granted a concession to a Canadian mining company, Continuum Resources, over 62,000 hectares of their lands. At first, the company's representatives attempted to garner the community's support for an open pit mining by offering jobs. Calpulalpan refused to allow the company in its land. Then, the company attempted to bribe communities' authorities, but those attempts also failed because the communal governance system prevents individual landholders and authorities from making decisions concerning resources without the consent of the assembly. Despite the community's refusal, the company initiated exploration in 2005. The mayor of this community was very critical of the company, denouncing that 13 water springs were at the risk of being contaminated, and they started to be contaminated by the company's illegal practices. Like the forest, water is of significant importance to Indigenous communities. Water is a life-giving entity. It permeates all organic entities and organisms. Water circulates and connects bodies, territories, and beings. To Calpulalpan, a community without water has no life on which future generations can depend on. Water as life provides a useful focus to think about the environmental violence that is committed against different bodies: human bodies, bodies of land, bodies of water, non-human bodies, and community of bodies. The current struggle against mining cannot be separated from the struggle to defend the communal forest. Unlike other anti-mining movements, in Calpulalpan, there are no visible leaders, no visible spokespersons, but rather a community that insists in co-thinking and co-feeling with the land. In other words, a community that thinks from the heart and from the territory. Once again, Indigenous women have been instrumental in mobilizing to protect their territory. While the Assembly of Communal Landholders was considering different strategies, women blockaded the community's road. Women and their families also organized a blockade of the Mexico City Oaxaca highway, interrupting the circulation of goods through the central artery of the country. Men's opposition to mining has often been framed in relation to the processes of granting concessions. Women are concerned with the social reproduction of their families and the social reproduction of their communities. From their perspective, the social reproduction of communities cannot be separated from the defense of water and territory. In refusing mining, memories, feelings, and thoughts have been central to bringing people together in the present. Community members still remembers the legacy of exploitation, death, and water contamination left by past mining. Women still remember the stress of losing loved ones at the mine and the workload they had to endure after their deaths. These memories and felt experiences stand at odds with the industry's official registers, which emphasize jobs and economic rationality. The feelings and memories of situated bodies evoke a consciousness and collective history that reveal the violence of resource extraction. The mining company was found to be in serious violation of waste disposal procedures and was ordered to suspend activities. The then mayor of Calpulalpan noted that in the new phase of mineral extraction, it is not only land that is at risk, but also biodiversity, water, and our sacred places. In other words, it is indigenous life that is at risk. To Calpulalpan, refusing extraction is not only a matter of refusing mining, but also about building an alternative future. At different regional encounters, this community has insisted on the need for communities to revitalize their governance systems and institutions and remember felt experiences. It has also insisted that this community builds a political project that is anchored in the past, yet projected to the future. Through everyday communal practices, the anti-mining struggle is grounded on the collective will to self-determine other forms of being in the world that remembers the web of relationships that constitutes indigenous life. What does it mean to live in community with a non-human world in Oaxaca? How do indigenous women reimagine relationships? I propose that a bodyland pedagogy involves co-learning and co-thinking from the heart in order to understand how indigenous women's struggles not only transforms how the micropolitics of everyday life intersects with the defense of territory, but also how these processes are felt and experienced. Indigenous women's resistance to capitalist violence is not mere self-preservation, but the exercise of practices of freedom that centers indigenous life and relationships. If the warfare by which resource extraction takes place engulfs different forms of life, placing relationships at the center of our analysis move us away from anthropocentric accounts of political life. In this way, the indigenous political practices that reject both power and the hierarchy of life give us the opportunity of envisioning alternative ways of relating to the earth and the non-human world in ways that are effective, reciprocal, and responsible. Understanding people's relationships to place and the non-human entities as fluid, as shifting over time, and through flows of people, other species, and social practices captures the different realities that shape how place is experienced and practiced. As a multidirectional and multi-species relational pedagogy, bodyland accounts for the very act of relating to multiple strands of materiality, corporeality, kinship, and affect. As such, it brings to the surface the laws that human beings and non-human beings abide by in the process of living together in community, and the ways in which such relationships are actively nourished through specific practices and designs on the land. In this sense, bodyland evokes an active and ongoing process of making relations, one that is recreated and transformed to adapt to changing contexts. While the violence of mining is felt by different bodies, Indigenous women's bodies become a territory from which Indigenous collective death is refused. While Cartesian separations of mind and body, mind, land, life, and non-life enable possessions and conquests, Indigenous women land defenders insist on protecting bodies with their bodies. Thus, considering Indigenous women's body as a political territory that is historically constituted involves the exploration of how gender relations within communities interweave with transformations, reproduction, and disruptions of people's relationships to territory, non-human beings, and community of bodies. At the same time, this requires paying attention to the effects and feelings produced when people are confronted with power structures, gender violence, and processes of dispossession and capital accumulation that render them disposable and force them to migrate and endure everyday violence and environmental harms. What is novel, in my view, about Indigenous women's relational practices is that they transform the right to own something into a human duty to protect non-human entities, the dignity of Indigenous women, and the communal relationships Indigenous peoples have with their territories. As a pedagogy, Bodyland organizes inquiry around commitments to Indigenous social and political thought with land as the foundation. As Tuck and Mackenzie have argued, relational validity is based on the understanding that human life is connected to and dependent on other species and the land. Research, in my view, is not only about describing how Indigenous life is lived and experienced, but about how, as researchers, we can also influence these conditions in any possible way. As a place-centered concept, body and land takes up critical questions that seeks to respond to critical place issues such as colonialism, resource extraction, neoliberalism, gender violence, and environmental destruction. These, in my view, are critical questions at this time in our lives. As a relational pedagogy, Bodylands help us to see Indigenous women and gender diverse individuals' political desires to have a dignified life without compromising the kinship structures that sustain Indigenous life. Going beyond the separation of land and body, this centers resource extraction as an hegemonic way of thinking about the earth and opens the space for imagining and envisioning other ways of living together with each other and with other beings. Chuskijali, thank you.
Miigwech. That was amazing. Liebe, oh, there's a question. We have a comment from somebody that said, thank you, such an insightful keynote. And I was wondering if it was okay if I could start with a question. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for your keynote. It is really fascinating work and writing, and I've been reading your work, especially related to neoliberalism, and I'm really struggling for myself as an Indigenous person how to balance the protection that we want to give to lands and waters, but at the same time of not wanting to own it in the commercial traditional sense of owning something. Mm-hmm. I just wondered if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and brings into the sort of table a lot of the contradictions that sometimes might face Indigenous peoples, in the sense that on the one hand, and I was reminded by a colleague who recently presented a book here at the University of Alberta, Robert Nichols, who was basically saying, in the Western world, land is sort of understood and structured in terms of possessions, right? In terms of property. As indigenous peoples that don't see land and territory as property, sometimes we're forced to speak that language to make claims to something that we didn't own as property, but that we have a special connection to, right? And that's one of the contradictions to be heard and to be understood in this particular context of how do we fight for something that the rest of the Western world doesn't understand, but just in terms of possession, right? So, and but it also, I believe that it opens the possibilities for indigenous communities to bring these other ways in which we think about land and territories. For the region that I come from Oaxaca, this idea of emphasizing community is extremely important in that sense, right? In the idea that we're part of the land. We're sort of part of this community where the land remains extremely important. And in that sense, it's not just talking about that we own it, but that there is a responsibility. So, instead of talking just purely in terms of this idea of property, we're also moving toward this idea of talking about responsibility, the responsibility that we have with our territories, the responsibility that we have to protect it, not to possess it. We're not fighting to possess it, but we're fighting to protect it. And I think that this is even more relevant today, that we are seeing all of the effects of climate change and the expansion of resource extraction. These are conversations that are, I believe, that are bringing something new to the discussion table, in the sense that if we continue to have these conversations about the earth just as an ever-growing pie, there will be no future, right? Not for other non-human beings, and not even for human beings. So, and we need to start shifting that conversation in ways that relationality about economics, about just an ever-growing pie and accumulation of wealth, needs to be sort of downgraded, and not to be maintained at this hegemonic idea that there is no other ways of thinking about the world. And what I believe that indigenous peoples, and particularly indigenous women, are bringing into this conversation is that we need to start getting out of this mindset of not imagining other possibilities. And let's start imagining, let's start expanding our horizon. There is other ways of doing things. The Western world doesn't have that imagination, but indigenous peoples do. So.
Miigwech. That was amazing. And there's so many other things I could think to ask you in terms of especially Indigenous women in Canada and my own situation. But I know we have a comment or a question. I wonder if Liba wants to ask on behalf.
Yes, thank you so much, Isabel, for that incredible lecture. And I have a few questions myself, so I'm just going to hold onto those, and then I'm going to give the mic to a colleague, but I believe they're not in a quiet space, so they've asked us to kindly share the question on their behalf. So this is from Michael Lechuga, and they're wondering, they say, as a researcher interested in decolonialism, futurism, and media, I was wondering if Doctora Altamirano Jimenez might be able to speak more on community as potential. Thank you very much for this lecture.
Yeah, I think in my lecture, I was talking about a community as located in a specific geographic space, right? In a specific territory. But I think that if there is something that I find really, really useful and important when I think about how in Oaxaca indigenous peoples understand indigeneity and community, is that community doesn't have to be fixed on a geographic space, right? In the same way that indigeneity doesn't have to be fixed on a specific landscape. This is, my indigeneity, if I can put it this way, is portable. I am indigenous where I am located at this moment, even though I'm not in my homeland, right? And I have these ways of related to the place where I'm located. In the same way, I also think that, and it was what I was mentioning, to be part of an indigenous community in Oaxaca is not what makes you to be adopted into a community is your will to be in relationship with people, your will and your responsibility to engage in those relationships and to participate into the making of that community in ways that maintain that community of bodies in vital ways. If we extrapolate that into other circumstances, one could argue that we can create those communities elsewhere, and we can create those, those relationships of responsibility in that process. How we envision those communities might take different forms, in urban areas, might be completely different, right? But that doesn't mean that the responsibility of creating that community is not there. And I'm thinking, for example, of the indigenous Zapotecs and Mixtecs that live in the US, particularly in California, and how they constitute those communities, even though they are in a different country. I think that there is a lot to be learned from how indigenous peoples make communities, make relationships. As I was saying, this is a verb. This is something that we do. We don't just announce that community exists, but we create them. And we create them through our very engaged practices, active engaged practices of making these relationships and community. And that's what I would suggest, that the potentials of making these communities elsewhere exist. We have to enact them.
Thank you. That was really good. I could have had questions from that, but we have a question from the audience. Tanya Agia Way, if you want to ask your question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Altamirano Jimenez, for this truly illuminating talk. My question has to do with the intersection between territorially specific ways of what you've been describing as thinking and feeling with the land, mm-hmm. and the larger global structures of neoliberalism. I'm wondering how the land defenders that you have been speaking about, the women land defenders, how they account for or think about the embeddedness of their own territory in these larger structures that are bringing a Canadian mining company into their territory.
Oh, thank you for that question. I think it again is a question that that I've been looking at in myself, just because of the research that I'm doing, but also because Canadian mining specifically at this particular moment constitutes the majority of the investment in Mexico and most of Latin America. Like, the presence of mining is extremely important. And part of what I'm doing in my work in sort of trying to think about this, and this is something that I have written in an article that is coming up, is that I am thinking about how, for example, settler colonialism has an imperial dimension of it, right? Where this idea that it is mobile, it goes places. And to me, when I think about mining, that's one of the ways in which this operates, right? Like this idea that in order for mining to move to other places, there is two things that are happening. One is what Jody Bird calls like the transit of empire, right? Like at how, in order for empire to move, countries of the global south, such as Mexico and others, have to become indigenous, right? Like in this colonial sense, have to become native and be constructed as these countries that need to be changed or that need to be intervened in order to transform them into better economies and you name it. And when that happens, indigenous people disappear completely, right? Because it's the country that becomes this native, and is the indigenous people that we disappear. Our lands become sort of like these empty lands. And I, you know, in a different piece, I have also written about my homeland and how, you know, not necessarily talking about mining, but talking about something that is the construction of that industrial wind parks. One would think at this time of, you know, climate change, that that's a good thing. But the ways in which these conservation projects are also happening constructs indigenous people's lands as empty lands, right? As these lands where these projects can take place and so on. And to these processes, I think that indigenous peoples and indigenous women land defenders are sort of responding in ways that are sort of, you know, making visible that these lands are not only not emptied, but that they are actually imprinted with histories of relationships, with a web of relationships that is alive, that exists at this particular moment, and that has existed always. If these neoliberal and imperial processes transform my people into nobody and transform my lands and my territories as empty, we are insisting in making visible the relationships that have developed for millennia in these territories. As the way I think about it, and the way that a lot of people think about it in Oaxaca, is that those ecosystems, those pristine environments that exist in indigenous territories, they don't exist just because there is no people there. On the contrary, they exist because indigenous peoples have always been there. We have always been there. We have co-produced those ecosystems and those environments through our practices, through our knowledge, through the ways we co-think and we co-feel with a non-human world. We have made it. You know, we have made this to come into life. And that's something that, to me, counter argue these sort of these imperialist imperatives of transforming our lands and our nations into nobody's and nobody's land.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tanya, and hello from this side of the world.
Hello there.
Hi. Okay, so thank you very much, Isabel, for that response as well. And I'm very interested in this notion of co-feeling. So maybe we can talk about that after. But I'm going to give the voice to Sarah Krotz, who's the current director of the Canadian Literature Center. And I think she has a question.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much for your talk, which was really inspiring, and it just it got me thinking about the ways that that your concepts resonate across Canadian contexts too.
Mm-hmm.
And I particularly, as a literature scholar in particular, I appreciate your emphasis on reimagining, the importance of reimagining right now in order to shift our relationships with Indigenous lands and of course with, non-human environments just across the whole planet. But I wondered specifically if, living here in Edmonton, your work has intersected with local issues. I was thinking about the Wet'suwet'en pipeline
Mm-hmm.
protests, for example, but even, in what you were just talking about, I was thinking about the solar farm that's just been approved in Edmonton's River Valley on land that has, among other ecological significances, archaeological significance for local Indigenous people. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how your work maybe resonates here as well.
Well, it totally resonates for a lot of reasons. I think the fact that I live and work in Treaty 6 territory has defined and has shaped my work since the beginning. My work has always been, comparative, Canada and Mexico, precisely because I feel like my responsibility is not just with my community, with the territories where I come from, but also with the place that I live and work with in that sense, I cannot not pay attention to what is happening in this area as well, right? And my research, my current research, obviously is paying attention to what's happening in Western Canada, in Alberta, and so on. And I definitely, I find a lot of resonance. And when I started thinking and trying to articulate sort of how this concept of body land, to me, that's something that allows me to think about these two different places that otherwise would, for some people, can seem completely disparate, completely separate. But allows me to think about that in the sense that I see a lot of that resonance in terms of how Indigenous peoples think about their connections to land and so on. I was doing research, talking with Indigenous women activists last year, and as part of the methodology, I would say, that I have developed to talk about this concept. In engaging with these conversations with these women, one of the things that I would ask them to do is to sort of represent how they saw their bodies in relation to their territories. And some of these representations were incredible, were amazing, in terms of that they went far beyond what we sometimes can articulate with words, right? Like this idea that something that you feel, that you sort of has something that is not necessarily rational. And I also came to the realization that there are some important differences that make me think about the fact that, and we have to admit that in some Indigenous communities in these areas and other parts in Canada, the ability to continue to survive solely in the traditional economic activities of Indigenous peoples have disappeared, in the sense that the settler state has been instrumental in making these economic activities, make them disappear, right? There has been an historically active set of policies to make Indigenous peoples not to continue to do that. And that's a difference with the region that I come from or other communities in Oaxaca where these activities continue to be important. And if I can put it this way, what I see there in Mexico is something that would have seen in Canada probably in the 60s. These processes of separation of indigenous people from the land that had happened here before, right? And there are a lot of indigenous women land defenders that today are basically, because the problem is that that hasn't stopped in Canada, right? While they're trying to sort of look at what's happening in their communities, these economic projects, these development projects continue to put a lot of pressure on these communities. It's like a non-stop. It's one after another project that continue to be approved. And we're talking about mining, we're talking about farming, we're talking about, you name it. It is projected that in the next 10 years, like more than in the next few years, more than 600 projects, new projects have been approved already and will start, right? So that to me tell me about the need to start thinking about what's happening and where are we going with this way of thinking about the economy, but also makes me think about the insistence of a lot of the indigenous women. And I'm thinking about the Wet'suwet'en and the tiny house warriors, for instance, and others who continue to insist, you know, in this conversation, what indigenous peoples to me in Oaxaca, in Mexico and Canada are saying is we need to have we have the right to say no. And in these conversations, it's always about that. It seems like the ultimate option we have is to just say yes. But what we need to bring into the conversation is that, you know, it's not just always yes. We need to learn, and we desire to say no. And a no is a no. And not just within these possibilities of, well, you know, let's consult with indigenous peoples, because then they can just say yes. You know, I'm not saying that in some cases they will say yes, but that there are indigenous peoples who want to say no. And that no needs to be heard as well.
Wow, I think I can say thank you on behalf of everybody, because that was a really, really great answer. And I know myself as an Indigenous person from Canada, I've been thinking a lot about these things and the ability just to say no, and we want our land back, and we're not going to give you a solution. Just to have that freedom feels like perhaps a tiny bit of reimagining like you talked about. So thank you so much for that. We have a question from Melanie Dene, which I will ask on her behalf. What do you think about Indigenous leaders who negotiate deals with resource extraction companies? Meanwhile, Indigenous grassroots movements are opposed. It seems as Indigenous people, we're also resisting within our own communities.
Yes, definitely. And we have talked about this, Melanie. We have had this conversation before about this is happening, right? Like, you know, and this is not just happening here as well, it's happening in Mexico. I see this where there is an indigenous leadership that, for whatever reasons, they engage in this, you know, in giving some kind of consent to these projects. But there is a disconnect sometimes between this leadership and these communities, where there is no necessarily these dialogues. I'm not saying that Indigenous leaders are making easy decisions, because they are not, in the sense that they are confronted with a lot of changes, with the fact that they are negotiating with powerful states such as the Canadian state and the Canadian government and so on, and the industries, lobbies, and so on. And they also know that sometimes communities need something, needs to make a living, right? So these are serious concerns. But what I also think that sometimes happens is that there is a disconnect between what this leadership might think the solutions are with the solutions that perhaps having a conversation among more bodies would be able to reveal other possibilities, right? Other ways of doing things. And that's what I believe that is complicated. And that's what, in my view, the case that I was talking about in my paper helps in thinking that it's possible that if this community has been somehow successful, one, in regaining control over the communal forest and in stopping mining, is because they have done that work of actually engaging in these conversations as a community, right? At the beginning, it was extremely hard, precisely because what you described, like this leadership that had granted or had approved the concession to this paper mill company in the 50s, that they had said, yeah, you can come and exploit our forest, without having these conversations with the community. And eventually, it was the community that took away that. The power of this leadership to make those decisions, right? By basically saying, no, we make decisions differently here. And we need to go back to our traditional forms of governance, so that to prevent these kind of individual decisions from continuing. And that's sort of like the process of engaging in these conversations and engaging in these, what has been called also resurgence, right? Like this idea that it's not just about going with the flow, but if we're not going with the flow, then what do we build instead, right? And that's not an easy thing. That takes a lot of work, right? That happens with a lot of work. Doesn't happen just because we want it to happen, but it takes a lot of conflict. It takes a lot of listening to everyone, and it takes a lot of commitment. And that's why, to me, when I was talking about relationships and being in good relationships, it starts with communities as well, and how do we come to these kind of relationships where we feel that we all are accounted for, that our voices are accounted for, that we're able to freely express what we feel and what we think about these processes that are affecting our life and that are going to affect our children's lives.
Thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Live.
Yeah, no, you're being so generous with your responses, Isabel. We're just taking a lot of notes here, and we have a number of different questions still coming in. So, are you happy to continue
Yeah,
for a few minutes? Thank you. So
I'm giving away my book.
Oh.
I'm just inviting you to.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to take an anonymous question first. So they're saying the Mexican government is currently proposing to draft a feminist foreign policy, but how can it be feminist when there is a continual dispossession of land and extraction of resources, as well as the weaponization of indigenous land, the Sonoran Desert, that lets migrants die on the trail? Do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, one of the things that I'm going to say is that the fact that the Mexican government at this moment is concerned with drafting a feminist initiative didn't happen just because the state thought, oh, this is a good idea. We are in 2020 and let's think about. No, it doesn't happen. It's not just resource extraction that is taking place in Mexico at the moment. It's not just that indigenous peoples are being displaced from their lands and forced to migrate. We are living in a country with a very disturbing trend of gender violence that some feminists in Mexico call feminicide, right? The fact that the number of women that are murdered and that suffer gender violence at this moment has driven women to go out and to the streets and protest, and women from all backgrounds, because this is something that is affecting everyone in that sense. And to, I don't know how many of you heard about it, but one day women decided to disappear from the public space, not going to work or to school, and a day without women. They also, have been in the streets basically saying, enough is enough of this violence, right? So they have actually made it possible. They have been the ones that have driven this gender initiative that that the government now is taking into consideration. Sadly, I am not as optimistic about this, in the sense that, to me, when I hear at the same time the Mexican president as well minimizing some of these, what is happening to women in the country, to me, it tells me somehow that to what extent this is a real commitment to initiate changes that will protect women in these circumstances, right? Like, I'm happy that has happened, that indigenous women, that other women supporting this have sort of made the Mexican government initiate this gender initiative. But on the other hand, is going to take way more than just an initiative to end with the gender violence that is being experienced in Mexico at the moment. And is going to take way more than that to actually start to prosecute those who commit these violent crimes against women, in the sense that most of these cases have gone unresolved. Most of these cases just stay there as something that we say, well, just one more woman that have gone murdered, that have disappeared. And we need to start doing something that this requires way more than just an initiative.
Thank you for that, Isabel. I'm also thinking about Spain, for example, and all the cases that we have there as well. Ted Osterwald also says, La revolución de la diamantina. Thank you for that. Yes, Amanda.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, we have a comment from Ellen Marie Jensen, and she says that she loves the idea that my indigeneity is portable, and that it is about the relationship to place and community. That goes far to affirm the Indigenous activists who are working for their people outside of their territories and lands. So that was a comment we had. And then we have a question. Let's see, from Tula Sharma Vasik. First, she says, thank you so much, Yitu. I have a question. Does Altamirano Jimenez have any thoughts on the ways we can reconstitute the relationships between our communities, our bodies, and the land in areas where the colonization has gone as far as almost eradicating these relationships for many?
I think, you know, what comes to mind first when I hear this question is what Leon Simpson says about this idea that we need Indigenous kids to reacquaint themselves with Indigenous histories and Indigenous stories. We need this generation to think about, to start feeling and to start thinking about ways, you know, in which they can experience that with, you know, that relationship with the land. Definitely, I think that if something colonialism has done, and capitalism for that matter, is this insistence in separating, in disjointing, in separating people from other people and families. Everything has been disjointed, right? And to me, it's about putting it all back together, right? But in order to put that back together, we also need to know our stories. We also need to know, to start reclaiming those stories. We need to start relearning them. And, you know, I know that not everybody speaks their language. I know that not everybody knows about those stories. So, but we need to start there. We need to start sort of reclaiming these ways of being and these stories. And we need to start telling them to our kids in ways that they start making sense as well, right? And reclaiming these relationships in important ways. And again, when I think about, in my case, myself and my kids not being in my own territory and thinking about these relationships, and, you know, and again, what does it mean for me to be here and for my kids to be in Treaty 6 territory, but still maintain those connections with my homeland and try to maintain certain relationships here with the place that I live in, right? And how, again, you know, if something I have learned from Oaxaca, from Indigenous communities in Oaxaca, is that these relationships can be enacted anywhere we are, right? And but we need to understand, what does it mean to be in those relationships for our own people, from our own communities.
Thank you. On behalf of Ellen and Tula Segitu, they're both from Same community, so they wanted to share that with you and say thank you for your talk.
Thank you. We have another question from Stella Melili, who is a PhD candidate in our department, the Department of Teacher Education at NTNU, and she will ask the question herself.
Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Professor, for this great lecture, and thank you, everybody, for very interesting questions and your answers. Yes, thank you, Libe, for introducing me. My question comes from my interest, because I am currently doing my PhD in literature and representations of refugees. So I've been thinking about the concept of nation and land, of course, and I would like to ask you, what are your thoughts about this relationship between, like, the concept of land? I love the concept of body land pedagogy that you introduced, and the contemporary refugee crisis, in particular the words that I used, like resettlement of refugees and the creation of hospitable communities towards refugees. So maybe my question was a bit confused, but please tell me if I have to reformulate.
Yes, please.
Yes. I'd just like to hear from you. What are the criticalities in this relationship between land and the refugee crisis that is happening today?
I think that, you know, the relationships to land that I've been talking about, and you know, this idea of relationality relates to indigenous peoples, right? And not everyone relates in the same way. You know, this is something that I'm talking about indigenous peoples. But also, if we somehow translated some of these ethics, of some of these ethos into hospitable lands or territories, I would, you know, one of the immediate things that I think about is when this was, I believe, last year, when there was this massive migration of indigenous peoples and, you know, non-indigenous peoples from Central America going to attempting to get to the United States. There was all of these debates about, you know, why supporting these people, you know, why doing anything at all about these people, why Mexico will try to support them if you know, if Mexico couldn't do anything even with its own people. And what I saw in terms of the responses with a lot of these indigenous communities that were where they were going along the way, is that indigenous communities didn't necessarily stop to think whether or not we are going to support these people. They just did. They just, you know, took them food and water to support them in their journeys, right? And sort of like showing this solidarity, showing this responsibility, and feeling with these people, right? Like and understanding that leaving your territories, leaving your homelands, leaving your homes is not an easy thing, and let alone in those conditions, right? So the least you can do is to try to support people in these journeys and these processes. And the same happens when, even before, right? Like when all these migrants coming from Central America and taking this train that traverses part of my territory and going into, you know, when they are trying to go to the United States. Again, it was these indigenous women from these communities that, without having tons of resources, they will prepare all of these, you know, bags with food to give to the migrants every day. Every day they will do that. And again, you know, the thing that makes them do that is this responsibility of relating to other human beings. And you don't have to know them, but you just do, right? And there is this idea that, you know, we live in this world together. And we also enter in those relationships with strangers, in these relationships of solidarity with strangers, I would say. And to me, the idea of building a hospitable place for migrants involves somehow this notion of being in relationship with these strangers, with these migrants that need support as well.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you, Stella, for your question.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for using so much of your time already. And we just wondered if you would have time for one more question.
I'm looking at the chat, and so I think that there is some question here that we didn't talk about, and and it says, may I address it?
Yeah.
And it says, is not body-land connection related to the idea of embodied sovereignty is not taken up as a theme in contemporary Indigenous literature? Yeah, definitely. It is, and, when I think about the ways in which Indigenous people think about it here in Canada, about, the idea of body sovereignty, for example, that's something that is connected to we cannot talk about sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, or Indigenous self-determination without body sovereignty first. Like, those are extremely interconnected, right? And the idea of, talking about body land, Indigenous women are talking about this. When I think about Latin America, Indigenous activists and Indigenous women talk about this idea of tierra, cuerpo, territorio, tierra, or, body, territory, land. This the same thing that they are talking about, right? Like the idea of assuming that Indigenous women's bodies have been a site where the sovereignty of the state, of the colonial sovereignty, has been a site of that violence. And we cannot not talk about body when we talk about land, because even though that sovereignty is asserted on a particular territory, bodies have been instrumental, and particularly Indigenous bodies have been instrumental to that process. And definitely we can keep talking about that, what the Indian Act did in Canada, the many legislations, the many ways in which Indigenous women's bodies have been regulated, their reproductive capabilities regulated, and all of these different things that have happened in Canada, and similar things that are happening in Mexico. When I think about the gender violence that Indigenous women experience and that go invisible when we talk just about feminicide as a whole, right? And that I insist that we need to make that distinction as well, because while we're talking about feminicide about this particular moment, colonial sovereignty cannot be understood without that gender violence that Indigenous women have experienced since that very moment of colonial violence, right? And definitely in the idea of talking about, developing this concept that other people have used as such, just to convey that connection, to me is about not just centering land, but the specific ways in which bodies and land have been disjointed with violence. And that's sort of like what I'm trying to do and with my work.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And this is great because that was the last question that we had time to cover. So that was fantastic. So we have recorded the session, and from what I understand, all the questions also get saved. So we're very happy to share the lecture and the questions afterwards with all the people attending. So I would like to thank you very much for your very generous talk and engaged response with everyone. And I think this speaks to also to this notion of responsibility that you were talking about, right? The way you were able to respond to all the participants also in a very caring and ethical, like raising ethical questions. So thank you very much on behalf of Marie and Dominique as well. And I'll give the final word to Amanda.
Yes, miigwech for this talk and for all of your writings. They've meant a lot to me personally as an Indigenous woman, and I'd like to say that a lot of your writings has given me the words to describe exactly how it is I'm working. And in my master's thesis, I wrote that I wear my research. And as a part of that, my sister has been giving me my markings. I'm not sure if you can see them.
Yeah, definitely can see them.
So I'm very excited about, yes. Oh, please.
No, I was just going to say that thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to Skijeli. Yeah, I enjoy very much the conversation.
Yes.
And I appreciate what you're telling me, Amanda.
Oh, thank you so much. No, you're truly, it's an inspiration to have had you open our conference with this exciting keynote. And I'd just like to remind everybody to stay tuned, and there'll be more talks in 2021, and to just keep checking the info on the Canadian Literature Centre website and the Facebook page, because we'll have events there. So once again, miigwech for your time, for your wisdom, and for your relationships with us tonight.